Niall Ferguson says the United States is losing competitiveness, and there's one place to blame: Washington. Niall is a Harvard University professor and a Bloomberg TV contributing editor. He's with us this morning from Cambridge. Niall, good morning. And let's begin the conversation with this. What do you mean specifically by losing competitiveness? You testified in Congress about this. Share with us your views.
Well, it's not just about things like the exchange rate or unit labor costs, narrow measures of competitiveness, by which the US does quite well, actually, in international terms. It's more that when you look at the broad institutional framework that the country has to offer, I think it's deteriorating. And very good evidence for that came from a recent study by my colleague here, Michael Porter of the Harvard Business School, who surveyed more than 1,000 former HBS, Harvard Business School alums, and asked them about decisions whether to locate in the United States or abroad, decisions by their companies. And an amazingly small percentage, only 16% of these decisions, went in favor of the United States. Porter then asked, why was that? Why were you opting for foreign locations? And the answers were fascinating. Regulation, uncertainty about taxation and macroeconomic policy, as well as the issue of poor skills based on educational outcomes. So when you look at competitiveness in those terms, particularly the institutional regulatory framework, actually the United States is declining in terms of competitiveness.
Who's on the flip side of this, Niall? Who's actually gaining in terms of competitiveness against the U.S.?
Well, of course, China is a prime suspect. And sure enough, when you look at the World Economic Forum's Competitiveness Index, which is something they produce every year, since they standardized their method 7 years ago, the U.S. has lost about 7% in its competitiveness score, and China's is up 20%. But it isn't just China, actually. If you compare the United States with Canada, I was doing this just the other day on a trip to Vancouver, and I was really struck by the fact that the World Economic Forum's measures of regulation, rule of law, things like that. There are about 15 different measures of the quality of institutions, and Canada beats the United States on all 15.
You don't say. Niall,
that just made Erik's day, Niall.
Niall, I want to contrast, if I may, what you're saying with what we hear from so many American executives. I'm going to quote very briefly from Jamie Dimon's annual letter to shareholders. He, of course, is the CEO of J.P. Morgan. He says, "I'm struck that so many of our leaders in the United States forget how strong our country can be. The U.S. has the world's best military. It will have for decades. It has the world's best universities and the best rule of law." Are American CEOs out of touch with the things you're saying?
I have huge respect for Jamie Dimon, and he's right about the military, he's right about the universities, I would say that, wouldn't I? He's wrong, of course, about the rule of law, and this is a widely held misapprehension that you encounter not only among executives, but among legislators. Actually, in terms of the rule of law, the United States is far from being number one. If you look at, say, the World Bank's assessment of global governance, which measures the rule of law in a whole bunch of different ways, the US is really quite far down the pecking order. Same if you ask the people at Heritage. They do a kind of health check on institutions in terms of economic freedom. The US is only barely in the top 10. So I think we have to look very carefully at this proposition that the US is number one in terms of the rule of law. The evidence is that it ain't. In fact, Hong Kong scores much more highly in terms of investor protection, in terms of the transparency of regulation. And I do think we have to look at Washington here and ask the question, is the quality of legislation itself deteriorating? Think of the incredible complexity of the Dodd-Frank bill. And also, are the regulations just out of hand? And I think if you ask most executives, whether they're in big or small companies, hey, how is regulation affecting your business? They're not going to smile back at you and say it's just great. Not in the United States, anyway.
Niall, is it fair to point the finger at Washington alone? I want to quote, or at least make reference to another quote, this one from the same study by Michael Porter and Jan Rafkin that you cited before. "The United States is a competitive location to the extent that companies operating in the U.S. are able to compete successfully in the global economy while supporting high and rising living standards for the average American." That is a definition that makes a lot of sense to us here and probably to you too, but that's not how companies define competitiveness. They can define competitiveness in terms of their ability to make money, whether it's here or whether it's somewhere else. So are we perhaps not looking at it the right way?
Yeah, I think that's exactly the point that Mike Porter and his colleagues are trying to make, that companies in the US tend to assess competitiveness very narrowly, the quarterly number, right? And when you look at the way companies responded to the crisis in the US, their first response was to shed labor. Now, the bottom line held up pretty well, and indeed, cash kept rolling in to the extent that many US corporations are absolutely rolling in money. But the impact on the labor market has actually been profound and negative compared, say, with a country like Germany, where companies try to keep their workers even if only on short time. I think one of the points that needs to be made very emphatically is that the United States may have done permanent damage to its labor force by laying people off, and some of these people have been unemployed now for a very long time. We're seeing for the first time in the US a phenomenon that we used to associate with Europe, long-term unemployment, which can ultimately become a permanent condition. That's the kind of competitiveness that a country really cannot afford to lose, even if it looks okay on the balance sheet or on the quarterly statement of a corporation.
Well, quickly, Neil, this is big picture stuff. In the long run, no question what you're saying rings true. But for now, the U.S. is a leader in technology innovation. We have the Apple, which makes the iPads and everything else that everybody wants. We're now exporting energy. I mean, what is the big risk here that you're so concerned about?
I think the risk is that there's the possibility, and it's growing all the time, that the next Apple will not be based in the United States, that the next big technological breakthroughs won't happen here. And I think simply to assume complacently that because we had Steve Jobs, we'll have the next Steve Jobs, is to underestimate the kind of problems that I'm discussing here.
Neil, thank you for joining us, and good to see you. Niall Ferguson, Harvard professor, Bloomberg Television contributing editor, with a warning: America risks complacency.